I had problems with the bleeder on the slave cylinder on the right hand side, so let's see about solving that problem.
Maybe it's a good thing that I didn't start on this side first, because first thing I find is the bleeder's sheared off. Oh, well, it wasn't the first thing. The first thing I found was that screw was in one side of the caliper, or the slave cylinder. Looking at it, I hope it's a metric thread, or has it just been bastardised in there? It seems to at least start in both sides. It might be an M6 thread, which means the thread in here isn't buggered. But so two things on the slave cylinder, which would have meant I'd given up on the restoration of them. I'm going to let that sit there with a bit of CRC soaking through it while I clean up the backing plate and put a shot of paint on it. This brake caliper off the right hand side front, it's the slave cylinder, not really a caliper, had a sheared off bleeder in this hole. Previous owner had attempted to remove it, and part of his methodology was to cut down here and off here, probably trying to get grippers or something onto the bleeder to wind it out. So that surface there has been lowered. It's normally flush with this surface. He was unsuccessful, so the bleeder was still blocked. I don't know whether he'd tried to drill it out. I set this up in the milling machine. That's what those washers are doing on there. And I had it sitting on a block there to hold it horizontally. And I used a 6mm end mill there to come in and machine what remained of the bleeder out of that hole. Now, this is an M7 thread with a 1mm pitch, which I happen to have the tap for. There's the very tip of it. If I come in close on that, you can see the little bleeder hole and the tapered point on there, similar to the end of this one. So that's what remained in the hole when I'd machined down inside that thread. Being M7, 1mm pitch, and M6 removed all the centre core out. This was sheared off about where my fingernail is there, and so that amount had to come out of the hole. That's the remains of the tip of it, and the hole itself has still got its original thread, and the bottom now has the taper. So if I wind, this is the bleeder out of the left hand side brake caliper. If I wind that into the hole, it seals off the hole properly. So I now need to make a new one of those. I intend to do that out of a piece of brass. I've got this old tap spindle, which I think I can just get the piece out of. I've got a 7 by 1mm die, and I've got the ability in the milling machine to cut the hexagon on it. So I'm going to go about that process. It's a lot of work to fix a $10 or a $20 caliper, but I've actually ordered a couple of new calipers. They're going to take a month to get here. So in the meantime, I'm going to just do this as a bit of an exercise. All this has to do is plug the hole and allow a bit of fluid to come through to bleed. You can't bleed with a blocked hole all the time. It needs to be able to be released. So I've put the thread on and machined one side of this bleeder, and it screws in there, and a little 45-degree seat on the bottom blocks the hole. I haven't drilled a cross hole in there, and I've got to drill right through the guts of it in the other direction as well. Next, I want to put the hex on. I'll do that in a hex collet block, gripping it over the top of the threads with the 7mm collet. Turn the features on the other end of this brass old tap spindle. I've finished off making this brass bleeder. It's got a little cross hole in the bottom there. It's, as it turns out, a 2.5mm hole down through, right through the centre. That's a 1.5mm hole at the bottom that it meets. The hex, 8mm hex on the top there, machined up nice, and then it's got a hose nipple, effectively. It looks pretty similar to the original metal one. I've got the metal one out of the left hand side slave cylinder to model. It's a bit beat up on the hex. So the brass one that I made, I machined out of an old ceramic tap spindle. There was just enough brass in that to do it. I can now go ahead, the new nipple, the new bleeder screws neatly into the slave cylinder, and we'll do the job. I mentioned earlier how this surface here had been cut down either with a hacksaw or an angle grinder, probably to try and expose more of the old sheared off brake bleeder to try and remove it. I don't think that's going to affect the operation of the new bleeder. Really all it has to do is plug the hole for most of its time, or be able to be released a quarter of a turn to release a bit of fluid when you're in the actual bleeding operation. So I think I've recovered this slave cylinder. It's going to take a month to get the replacement new one in, and the new ones are slightly bigger bore and made out of cast iron. They're cheap, and they'll do the job, but I might not be in a mad hurry to replace this. When they arrive, I might just put them in the spares box. So that exercise has been worthwhile. Well, I think it's going to be worthwhile. I'll go and put it on the bike and get the master cylinder handlebar lever organised and get some fluid in the system and see whether these front brakes actually work. Well, I'm probably a bit of a tragic, but I've spent another half a day modifying my $10 slave cylinder. This is the bleeder, brass bleeder that I turned up, because this slave cylinder, the bleeder had sheared off. The previous owner had cut the casting back at this level, tried to grab the piece of sheared off bleeder out of this casting, was unsuccessful. So the bleeder was completely blocked up on this 94 bike. Without being able to bleed it, you really can't make your slave cylinders work. The thread on these nipples is M7 1mm pitch, and I turned that brass fitting up. I used a 6mm end mill to plunge down inside the body of this casting to remove the remains of that nipple. There's the tip of the original nipple there with its little bleeder hole in it, and its 45-degree end. I successfully removed the old remains of the bleed nipple, tapped the hole that I'd ploughed in with a 6mm with an M7 1mm pitch tap. That wasn't particularly successful. There were still remnants of the bleeder in the thread. It didn't come out perfectly, and I think the tap wandered a bit, as well as the alignment of the 6mm end mill when I plunged in there probably wasn't perfect. So this bleeder and the original bleeder, an original bleeder from the left-hand side of the bike, was quite loose in the new tapped hole in this body. The nipple wasn't even sealing when it was supposed to be off. So my attempts to bleed the brakes or even fill the system with brake fluid was a bit of a disaster. There was brake fluid leaking from this even when the nipple was supposed to be off. So that was a fail. Overnight I had to think about it. This morning I came up with the idea of drilling the body of this slave cylinder out to take a 10mm thread. I've got a 10 by 1.25 thread now down into the body. I got a bolt, drilled it out with a 6mm drill and put a 7mm, an M7 tap through it that would fit the nipple, and effectively made a thread insert, and that's what you can see between here and here. The nipple that I made fits a lot better in that thread. I've put a little bit of thread sealer on there. I don't actually want any brake fluid leaking around the nipple when I'm bleeding. I'd like all the fluid to come out through the nipple on the end there. I'll see whether this liquid sealer I've used is effective in that. I've actually used red Loctite to seal the 10mm thread into the body of the slave cylinder. I've now invested quite a bit of time in this slave cylinder. The replacement new ones are coming in a month's time. I'm hoping I can get this running. I thought I had it nailed yesterday, but had issues. I've also got issues, I think, with the master cylinder up on the handlebars, but that's another problem, and we'll see how that goes.
That's it installed and working. Had issues with bleeding the actual master cylinder, but that's another story. Get out to your shed and have some fun.